A lonely widower bought a 19-year-old girl who was auctioned off by her own father. On that gray October morning of 1885, the clouds hung like a shroud over the village of Eiseltwald, so heavy that even the church bell dared not ring. The stone square, a place accustomed to markets and prayers, was gripped by a strange, almost complicit silence. Men in flat caps and leather boots stared at the ground, while women held their children just a little too tightly, as if they feared they too could be taken. At the center of it all, standing on a small wooden crate, was Elena Baumann. Her hair was pinned tight, her eyes were moist, but her gaze was proud. She was only 19, yet her hands were those of a woman who had already gathered more broken pieces and flowers. Her father, Klaus, kept his hat on his head, even before the priest, like a man with no shame left to lose. He called out the starting price as if he were hawking a tire horse. 100 Swiss francs, he muttered, to settle a debt, as if that were some acceptable excuse to sell his own flesh and blood. But no one answered. Not at first. The crowd stood motionless, like the trees surrounding the square, covered in an icy stillness. Elena, with her bare feet and arms crossed like an invisible shield, did not cry. Perhaps she had no tears left, or perhaps she knew that any tears shed there would be a gift to the grimy eyes that stared at her. The second bid came from a butcher, with a coarse voice and wine-stained teeth. The third, from a merchant who had a daughter Elena's own age. The humiliation wasn't just in the selling, but in the way she was being appraised, like a garment in a window of desperation. She kept her back straight, even as her father raised his voice to hurry things along. None of the women in the village moved. Not one dared to say that this was wrong. Fear was a thick veil, and in those days, so much was accepted in the name of order, of debt, of tradition. Then a quieter but firm voice rose. 50 francs. The silence was broken, but not with surprise. It was met with a faint collective stir, as if everyone knew who it was. Jakob Meier, a widower, a woodcutter, who lived up in the chalet called Lindenhof. He had lost his wife and son to a winter fever 7 years ago, and since then, no one had seen a light in his window or his footsteps in the market. He didn't look at Elena like the others. He looked into her, as if he could see a soul. And on that day, it was the most unexpected gesture of all. Elena's father hesitated. Jacob was respected, but also feared for his directness, for his solitude. He was the kind of man who accepted coffee from no one and joined no conversations at the tavern. 50 francs, Jacob said again without raising his voice, and she comes with me now. Elena looked at him for the first time, and in that gaze was something between disbelief and relief. Not because she was being saved, this was not a rescue, but because she was being taken by someone who, at least on the outside, didn't look like he wanted to break her. The square remained silent. The sound of the paper being signed echoed louder than all the shouts that had come before. As Elena stepped down from the crate and walked toward Jacob, something inside her shattered. Not because of the goodbye, but because she saw that no one, absolutely no one, had come to stop it. The stones of the square fell harder beneath her feet, the world more distant. But at the side of this man with broad shoulders and sad eyes, there was at least room for a new kind of fear, one she did not yet know. And you, where are you watching this from? Can you imagine standing in that square between the motionless faces and the icy winds of the Swiss Alps? The path to the Lindenhof chalet was narrow, made of hard earth covered in damp leaves. Elena walked behind Jacob, their steps creating a silent score in the mud. He made no attempt to start conversation, never looked back, but he didn't quicken his pace either. He walked at her rhythm, as if he knew you don't rush someone carrying a broken soul. The surrounding mountains, shrouded in mist, seemed to watch the scene with the same stillness that had held the square. There was something respectful in that alpine cold, as if the wind preferred to observe rather than judge. The chalet appeared between the pine trees, made of dark wood with a sloping roof, like a house that had bowed to time. Moss grew at the windows, and the door looked as if it hadn't been opened in days. Jacob turned the key carefully, and before entering, he held the door open in an almost ceremonial gesture. Elena watched him, hesitated, then stepped over the threshold with light feet, as if entering a sanctuary. Inside, the scent of old wood and the absence of noise created an atmosphere that was neither welcoming nor threatening. It was just a pause. A held breath. He pointed to the room at the back and said, "Only, you can stay here." The voice was deep, but not sharp. Elena walked down the small hall, where a portrait covered by a cloth rested on a shelf. In the room, the bed was simple, with woolen sheets and a folded blanket at its foot. A candle was already lit, as if someone had prepared this space without any hurry. Elena leaned the door closed, but didn't lock it. She knew that locking herself would not protect her any more than the eyes of the men in the square had, and something in her told her that Jakob would not try to enter. That first night, the only sound besides the crackling wood in the fireplace was the whistle of the kettle. Jakob placed 2 cups on the table and poured herbal tea. He didn't say, "Drink" or "Sit down." He just gently pushed the cup in her direction and looked back into the fire. Elena sat, her shoulders tense, her fingers still. She felt watched by the past, not by him. There was something about Jakob that was like an old book, covered in dust, but full of pages that could still be read, if one had the courage. In the days that followed, Jakob kept the same routine. He left early to chop wood and returned before sunset. He brought potatoes, flour, milk. He never asked her questions. He never tried to touch her. Elena began to sweep the floor, to wash the dishes, not as a servant, but like someone who needs to fill the emptiness between one sigh and the next. Time there seemed to move more slowly, as if the clock had decided to tick to the rhythm of each person's pain. And that was new for her. To not be used, not be rushed, to simply exist. One day, finding her on the porch looking out at the valley, Jakob said to her, "The storms here, they come on slowly." And that was all. But Elena understood. He was talking about the clouds. And he was talking about the heart, about how some pains need time to break, and how sometimes you just have to let them rain down in silence. She didn't answer, but she stayed. And in that staying, the story began to change. Not through words, not through promises, but through a presence that, for the first time, asked nothing of her. Jakob was not a hero. He was a broken man who had learned not to break others. And Elena slowly began to notice. She started to feel that here, in the chalet nestled between the mountains, there could be a kind of safety that didn't depend on locks or bolted doors. It was made of respect, of distance, of waiting, something far rarer than any promise spoken aloud. At the Lindenhof, the days passed like dry leaves carried by the wind, without hurry, without fuss, without a clear direction. Elena would wake early, before the golden light touched the windows, and sit on the edge of the bed, listening to the world outside. The branches cracking against the wind, the roof tiles creaking as if whispering old memories, and Jacob's footsteps, when he walked, always light, almost an apology to floorboards. Outside, he would head into the forest with his axe on his shoulder, leaving behind a silence that wasn't oppressive. It was just observant. Inside the house, Elena moved with the caution of someone walking through invisible shards of glass. Every object seemed to carry a history she didn't dare touch. The perfectly aligned cutlery, the rocking chair by the fire that never creaked, the folded clothes in drawers she didn't open. She cleaned gently, as if she weren't washing away dust, but the memories that slept there. Still, she felt like an intruder in a time that did not belong to her. Jacob's silence was respectful, but was also a mirror, and in it, Elena saw her own pain reflected. One day, while serving bread at breakfast, she dropped a white porcelain cup. The sound of it shattering echoed like a thunderclap between the wooden walls. Her body reacted before her mind. Shoulders hunched, hands flying to her face, and she crouched on the floor, waiting for the slap, the scream, the pull of her hair that always followed mistake. But what came was the sound of quiet footsteps. Jakob knelt beside her, gathering the broken pieces without a word, placing them carefully in a small wooden box by the hearth. Then he simply sat back down. That night, Elena wept silently, lying on her side, her face pressed against a rough linen pillow. She didn't cry out of fear, but out of confusion. Why did this man, who could do anything, do nothing? Why did he treat her like a person, even though he had paid for her as if she were an object. Her heart, so used to the whip and mistrust, didn't know what to do with respect. It didn't know how to breathe inside of it. And yet, slowly, that strangeness began to feel like a sanctuary. When she heard Jacob's steps on the porch, returning from the woods with his arms covered in sawdust and his face slick with sweat, Elena now opened the door before he touched it. A small gesture, but a gesture that was hers. Sometimes she would hand him a towel or a bowl of warm water, and he would take it with a slight nod. No smile, no praise. Just that quiet acknowledgement, so rare in the world she had known. The absence of word between them was like a silent dance of two people who don't yet know how to move, but who stand before each other all the same. One afternoon, as a fog veiled the mountain peaks, Jacob brought her a gray shawl. "The wind has grown stronger," was all he said. Elena took it with trembling hands, unsure if it was a gift or a passed-on memory. She wrapped it around her neck and felt something she had never felt before. Not belonging, but consideration. It was as if that small piece of cloth welcomed her into his world, not as a possession, but as a part of it. The chalet, which had once seemed like a prison, now began to have smells and sound that welcomed her. The creak of the floorboards no longer startled her. The wind at the windows sounded like a song. And Jacob's silence, which had so unsettled her, was now like a silent prayer, spoken not with lips, but with gestures. There were still shadows inside of her, but now, at least, there was a candle burning to meet them. Winter was approaching slowly, like an old animal circling before it settles on the earth. The days grew shorter, and the nights in the chalet seemed longer, filled with the crackle of fire and the absence of words. But there was something different in the silence now. It was no longer empty. It was full of anticipation, a space between two hearts that were no longer afraid, even if they did not yet understand each other. Elena began to leave her door ajar when she slept, and Jacob lingered a little longer on the porch when he returned, as if waiting for company without asking for it. In the third week of November, Jacob returned to the village with a small package wrapped in thick paper. He left it on the table, without explanation. Elena opened it to find a hairbrush with a hand-carved wooden handle, decorated with a delicate pattern of oak leaves. He had never said a word about her hair, had never touched her head, but he had noticed all the same. It was a gesture as silent as he was, and yet it screamed with tenderness. That night, she combed her strands before the mirror with misty eyes, as if her own femininity, for the first time, was not a threat, but a thing of beauty. Elena started to speak softly to chickens, to pick dry flowers to decorate the window, and even to sing in a whisper while she swept the floor. They were small, shy sounds, as if she were testing her own existence in this new world. Jacob, in turn, began to listen, tilting his head slightly when she spoke, waiting for her opinion on the bread, the cold, the tea. It wasn't a conversation. It was a cohabitation, like two candles slowly moving closer without extinguishing the other, until they warmed the same air. One evening, they both sat on the porch, gazing at the sky between the mountains. The stars shone with an almost cruel clarity. Elena, wrapped in that same gray-blue shawl, spoke without thinking. "Up here, it feels like the stars are listening." Jacob, after a moment, replied, "Maybe they're listening to what we forget to say." And in that instant, the silence between them became a bridge, a path made without words of breath and memory. The night no longer needed music, for there was presence. She began to tell him fragments of her childhood. The tree she climbed to escape her father's rage, the song her mother used to sing before she disappeared. Jacob listened in silence, but his eyes said what his lips still could not, that he was there, that he wouldn't leave, that those pains now had a place to rest. Elena then dared to ask about the covered portrait in the living room. He didn't answer in that moment. But the next morning, a small envelope with an old photograph was on the table. It was the image of a woman with braided hair and a boy with round cheeks, standing before the Alps. A younger Jacob held them by the shoulders. There was no letter, no note, just that portrait. But it was enough. It was the key to his world. When Elena touched the photo, she didn't cry. She just sighed. Now she knew. He, too, knew what it was to lose everything and keep breathing. And that, in an almost impossible way, made them alike. The portrait rested on the table, like a whisper from another time. The woman in the photo had gentle eyes and the resigned smile of someone who already knew life would not be easy. The boy, however, was pure light, his face beaming with the innocence of one who still believed that winters always end. Elena ran her fingers gently over the yellow paper, as if the gesture could soothe the tracks of time that this family had not been allowed to live. And there, in the silence of the morning, she began to understand Jakob not just as a man, but as an absence. In the following days, something in the house shifted, the way ice begins to yield under the sun. Jakob started leaving doors ajar, taking a deeper breath before he left, as if every gesture now said, "I don't have to hide anymore." Elena, for her part, tended his grief like someone tending a stranger's garden. Not cutting, not harvesting, just watering it with her presence. She didn't ask for names or dates. She just built the fire in the hearth more often, warmed bread in the oven, placed wildflowers in small pots next to portraits, small offerings to the memory of someone she had never known, but who was now part of her routine. One afternoon, while searching for firewood in the cellar, Elena found a wooden box sealed with a leather strap. She didn't try to open it. She just wiped it with a damp cloth and placed it on a visible shelf. When Jakob saw it, he froze. His gaze lingered on the object for long seconds. Then, without a word, he sat down and stared into the fire. Hours later, without her noticing, he left the box on the kitchen table. When Elena opened it the next morning, she found letters inside. Dozens of them, addressed to his wife. Some written, others never finished. They were simple, everyday words, full of restrained longing. "It snowed a lot today. Franz asked for you. I baked your favorite bread, but it doesn't taste the same without you. It's been 2 years since the fever. I still keep his room in order." Every sentence was a piece of the man Jakob had been, and the one he had ceased to be. Elena read only a few, then closed the box and returned it to its place. But when Jakob came home that evening, he found a bowl of soup on the table, exactly like the one he had described in one of the letters, made with potatoes, leeks, and nutmeg. When he tasted it, he just nodded, his eyes moist. That night, they didn't go to bed early. They sat before the fireplace, staying there like two survivors exchanging vital signs without words. Jakob, little by little, told her about the fever that had swept through the village. He told her his wife's name was Marie and his son's was Franz. He told her how the fever had taken him on consecutive days and how he had stayed here in the chalet because it was the only place he could still hear them laugh. Elena listened, her eyes lowered, her chest tight with a pain that was now also hers. She didn't say she understood because she couldn't, but she knew what it was to survive something without knowing how. She knew what it was to lose your own voice for fear it might reveal too much. And perhaps that is why, in the early hours of that morning, when she covered Jakob with a blanket before going up to her room, she did it with a tenderness born not of pity, but of sharing. She knew his grief would never pass, but now, at least, there was someone to bring him hot soup, to listen to his memories, and to walk beside him among the ruins of a past that was still beating. Winter was already knocking with icy hands, covering the peaks in a thick, white snow. Inside the Lindenhof chalet, the warmth was made of gestures, the routine of choreography the two of them learned together, with stacked bread needed, tea served without questions. But every piece, no matter how deep, carries the risk of memory. And on a gray afternoon, when Jakob had gone to the village to trade flour for oil, a presence shattered that fragile balance, bringing with it the metallic clang of an unburied past. Dieter Vogel rode into the tavern on a horse, as dark as the night. He was a large man with a harsh voice and an accent from the north that smelled of smoke and resentment. He carried a worn leather satchel, and inside it was a document written by Elena's father, a paper signed before witnesses, promising that in the event of default, the daughter could be seated as collateral. It was a cold contract. Legal. Cool. "She is with me now," Jakob said when Vogel confronted him. His voice did not tremble. He did not explain or justify. He simply stated it as fact. But Vogel smiled, a crooked smile. He said he had come to collect what was his, that Klaus had died the week before, leaving the debt open. With the tip of a quill, He pointed to the line where Elena's name was written. Property, he said, savoring the word. The news reached Elena through the silent mouths of the village. A child who had seen Vogel ran to the chalet, stammering that a bad man was down below, talking about her. Elena's breath caught. She felt the past like a cold blade at her neck. Jakob returned with his jaw tight. He said little, only that everything would be all right, but his voice didn't sound so sure this time. That night, Elena knew she had a choice, to stay and put Jakob in danger, or to leave and protect him. The memory of the letters, the hairbrush, the shawl, it all weighed as heavily as the debt written in black ink. She knew Vogel would return, and that men like him do not understand the word no when it is spoken by a woman. In the early morning, Elena packed a small bundle, a piece of bread, the blue shawl, and the photograph of Jakob, Marie, and Franz. Not as a memory, but as a promise. She left a lit candle on the table and a note written with a trembling hand. I did not leave out of fear of you. I left out of respect for what you gave me. She stepped out into the storm brewing in the mountains, her steps firm despite the wind, her soul broken but resolved. She could not let him lose again. The night fell like a thick veil over the mountains, the snow coming down in slow, dense flakes, erasing her tracks almost as soon as they were made. Elena walked, her heart beating louder than the wind. Every step was a farewell. To the warmth of the fireplace, to the welcome silence, to Jacob's eyes, which, without ever having touched her, had been her first true refuge. She was fleeing not out of cowardice, but out of courage. She knew that men like Vogel would not accept being rejected, that Jakob, as righteous as he was just one man against the world. She would not be the cause of another grief in his life. The snow gathered on her shoulders, but Elena didn't stop. She thought of the box of letters, of the bowl of soup, of Jakob finding her note in mourning, with the bread still warm and a new absence to taste. She almost turned back, but she kept walking. For him, at the chalet, the candle on the table still burned low when Jakob woke. He felt the emptiness instantly. He read her note 3 times, without tears, just with silence even deeper than usual. Then he stood, saddled his horse, and rode out without hesitation. The cold cut like a razor, but something stronger guided him. The feeling you don't name, but that makes a man face the mountains themselves. He didn't trust the tracks the wind had already blurred. He trusted his instinct, the invisible thread that had connected him to her since that first glance in the square, when he hadn't bought a young woman, but had decided to save her from being forgotten. Hours later, on a path that led to the edge of a cliff, he saw her, huddled beneath a pine tree, her face covered by the blue shawl, her eyes closed. He dismounted, knelt down, took the blanket from his own shoulders, and wrapped it around her. Elena opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from an old dream. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. He answered only, if you are here, then I must be here. He demanded no justifications. He just took her in his arms, as if she were made of glass and fire, and lifted her onto the horse. They returned slowly, without hurry, for now every step was a victory, every shared breath of forgiveness. As they rode back to the chalet, Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, for the first time without fear. The return was silent, but it was no longer a silence of pain. It was one of awe. As they arrived at the chalet, Jakob dismounted and carried Elena in his arms to the bed. The blanket still enveloped her shoulders, but what warmed her now was something else. The simple fact that someone had come for her, that someone had followed her not to possess her, but to bring her back to life. Jakob lit the fire and made tea, his gesture slower than usual, as if each one were a prayer of thanks for finding her in time. He knew, in that moment, that life would not give him Marie and Franz back, but that there was still room for another kind of love, one that doesn't replace, but adds. When Elena woke, the chalet was filled with the sweet scent of bread and honey. She went to the kitchen. Jakob stood with his back to her, kneading dough. When he heard her steps, he paused. He didn't turn. He just said, his voice low, you have the right to leave whenever you wish. But know this, no one will ever sell you again. Elena took a deep breath, as if an old knot of mistrust and fear had finally broken inside her. She took the blue shawl she had left in her bundle and wrapped it around her neck again. This time, she said softly, I am staying because I have chosen to. He turned slowly, and there they stood, facing each other for the first time not as the wounded, but as survivors. In that gaze was the deepest promise, the one that doesn't need to be spoken, that when the darkness returns, the other will not leave, and that, in the end, was all either of them had ever wanted. The Lindenhof chalet, which for so many years had housed only memories and solitude, now breathed differently. On Christmas Eve, the village saw Jakob Meier descend to the market, and for the first time, he was not alone. He was with someone who walked by his side, with calm eyes and a steady step. Some whispered, others looked away, but everyone knew that some mysteries are not meant to be understood with words. The snow fell gently on the roof, and inside, there was warmth. It was no longer just a home of a widower. It was a sanctuary of two survivors who had learned, together, that true love can be born from the ashes of silence, that you do not have to touch to care, nor possess to love, and that even in a world as hard as the Swiss mountains, there is still room for stories to be reborn. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe and stay with us. There are more memories hidden in the folds of time.